Struggling to communicate with your co-parent? That's why Peaceful Co-parenting Messenger was created. It's a communication tool for all co-parents, but especially those who are in high conflict situations. I always tell co-parents who ask, sign up for Peaceful Co-parenting Messenger as early as possible in your separation and divorce process, because you never know when you're going to need a more robust communication tool that allows you to set boundaries on the communication you have with your co-parent. Are you getting messages that look like war and peace? It's not a text message. It's the length of a novel. Set the brief chat limitation in the app and keep those messages short and to the point. It's about the kids, right? Keep the focus there. You can also limit the number of messages you receive in a day and other nice a la carte features meant to bring sanity to your life. You deserve that, and your kids do too. Peaceful Co-parenting Messenger in the Apple App Store and soon in the Google Play Store. Go to peacefulparentapp.com for more information.
This week on Peaceful Co-parenting Podcast.
That experience of therapy for my kids was incredibly damaging. My individual therapist, wonderful, awesome, trauma-informed, wonderful experience, but the experience for my children was horrible and did so much damage. And that was the piece that for me was like, something's not right here. Something isn't, there's either not information or not understanding. Kids like mine deserve better from therapists. So I will go. I will get trained as a therapist. I will find out what's happening.
Welcome to Peaceful Co-parenting Podcast, where we discuss strategies and tips to improve your co-parenting situation, especially if it's high conflict. I'm Bianca Ballo, co-parent, mother, and entrepreneur, creator of Peaceful Co-parenting Messenger app, and believer in turning challenging situations into something positive. This week, we're joined by Rachel Miller. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist and founder of Hold the Vision Therapy in Chicago. She is a PhD candidate at Adler University, where she's conducting her dissertation research on adult children whose parents' divorce or custody dispute was high conflict and had a history of domestic violence. Rachel, it's so great to have you with me today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Tell me more about you and your family.
I live in Chicago. I have two grown children. My kids are 20 and 24. I'm still in school pursuing this PhD of mine. I do a lot of work with couples, families. I do some co-parenting, divorce therapy. I have two cute little dogs you can check out on my Instagram page that are, they're my replacement for my children, is just what I tell them all the time. My kids grew up and I got dogs. And yeah, so like life is pretty busy for me and pretty intense, but I'm pretty passionate about the things I do. So it never feels like I'm busy.
Are you full-time as a therapist and then you're also getting your PhD? Wow.
Yeah. My kids like to call me an overachiever.
Yeah, that's a lot. So congratulations on everything you're doing.
Thank you.
Can you share your divorce story with us?
Sure. So I was married for about 15 years. By the time the divorce was final, it was more like 17. Did the whole married the high school sweetheart thing. Had two children. And when the kids were about 9 and 12, I finally left. The marriage had a history of domestic violence and abuse. It took me a long time to figure out what was happening and to really get to the place where I could and was ready to leave. We spent about 10 years in the family courts between getting the divorce finalized and then lots of repeat visits just due to continual conflict. People like to believe that once you end a domestic violence relationship, that the abuse ends. That's not my experience of that. It doesn't seem to be the experience of a lot of people that I know who have left. Thankfully, my kids have aged out. Everyone's good. One of my kids has a pretty good relationship with their dad. The other one has sort of navigated that on her own too. But getting out of the courts was an incredible relief. It's a long time to be dealing with that.
Absolutely. So would you categorize your divorce as a high conflict divorce?
The courts considered it high conflict. I initiated therapy for my kids because of concerns about what the process would do to them. The courts backed me on that when their dad did not want them to go to therapy. And then when things got really conflictual and there was some police involvement with an incident with my kids, then the courts were like, we need to do family therapy. which was interesting because my divorce agreement said that I did not have to have any actual contact with him. I was allowed to do only email conversations. The definition of high conflict for sometimes legal and therapy professionals is repetitive return to court. Because we couldn't manage without interference, like we had to have somebody involved, we were labeled high conflict.
That sounds really difficult and painful.
Yeah, it's a tough place to be. I got remarried in that space, right? Like, so my current husband had to deal with a lot of that stuff. My kids were continually dealing with it. Our families were dictated by that, right? Like where the kids were allowed, it was often dictated by court stuff. I would have to get clearance. They couldn't go with my parents to something with their cousins because it was his weekend, or we had like, that's the place that got really tough because it was just, nothing was simple.
So it doesn't sound like there was much flexibility for just when life happened, right? When these
Yes,
events
exactly.
kind of came up and they were on his time, then there wasn't that flexibility. So here we go again.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Lots of that.
So is that why you became a therapist then?
I had not gone to college. I got married right out of high school and done all those things. And so at 36, when I left, I did decide to go back to school. And at the time, I was more pursuing a sex therapy track because I had been doing adult sex education as part of my job. And so that was the plan. All of this happened. And I started to recognize, due to my children's experience of therapists, which were not great, to say the very least, I started to recognize that there was a problem in the therapeutic system where either they didn't understand domestic violence, they didn't understand domestic violence as it related to divorce. And I was like, does just nobody have training? What's happening here? So I chose the marriage and family therapy route when I chose graduate school, because it would allow me to do all the things I love, right? I still get to work with couples and I still get to do that kind of piece, but I was going to be able to dive in to this other component, which was, how do we do a better job of helping people split up? They're going to split up. How do we do a better job of that? And how do we do a better job of protecting the children who are part of that? And I really wanted to know what the research said. And then I found out there wasn't a lot of research. And I said, you mean to tell me there's no information on children like mine who watched the abuse happen in real time, had to deal with the courts for a long period of time, and still were mandated by courts to have visitation with their parent who they watched abuse their mom? And so I said, well, if there isn't any, then I guess that means I'll do it. I couldn't get what I needed for my kids. I couldn't find the information I wanted to be able to help and support my kids. And so I stepped into the space, and that's the work I'm doing now.
So was there very little research out there, or was there literally none?
On this particular demographic of how do therapists support children who are experiencing both domestic violence and a high conflict divorce, I didn't find any. Mm-hmm. There wasn't anybody that talked about the kids. There were conversations about how do you handle the grownups, like, here are the problems with the adults. Here's what's helpful for moms, or here are moms' experiences. There's still a lot of this framework of reunification and family togetherness is the preference. And I was like, but what if that's not always safe for kids? And there's also this belief in the courts that if a partner is abusive to their partner, it doesn't have anything to do with their children. Like, those are totally separate things. Even though there is research that indicates if the partner is abusive to you, they will probably also be abusive to children. As I've started to really look into this, it's been happening for decades, pretty much since divorce has been more common. And there's still not a lot of research there.
Yeah, I really want to dive into your research. But let me back up. You had said that you were ordered to go to family therapy, and that was everybody together for your family. And so how was the therapy that your family experienced on a group basis and also individual just not good enough, or wasn't useful for you?
I was not supposed to be involved. The therapist demanded and said he would not do therapy if I did not come to session. Mind you, he and I don't go in the same space. I have a PTSD diagnosis. I'd been struggling for years with panic attacks, and nobody can trigger a panic attack for me faster than he used to be able to. I was like, I'm sorry, I have to do what? My son had a panic attack in the office because the therapist kept pushing things and creating more damage than there was. Eventually, my ex-husband got tired of going to therapy and basically refused to go to any more therapy, which is how he finally ended up giving up overnights with my kids completely, because he just wouldn't go anymore. That experience of therapy for my kids was incredibly damaging. And their first experience of therapy, when we first started the process, when I asked for them to go and had to go to court to get permission for them to go because he didn't want them to, that therapist couldn't handle my ex-husband either. He showed up in the office unannounced with no appointment, demanded to see the therapist that was seeing the kids, created a scene, like then demanded all the records, refused to pay for those records. After about 6 weeks of that office told me that there was nothing they could do for my children, sent us away without a referral, and then never finished even billing us. So this was our experience of therapy. This was my individual therapist, wonderful, awesome, trauma-informed, wonderful experience, but the experience for my children was horrible and did so much damage. And that was the piece that for me was like, something's not right here. Something isn't, there's either not information or not understanding. Kids like mine deserve better from therapists. So I will go. I will get trained as a therapist. I will find out what's happening. I will do the research if that's what's necessary. And then I will continue to spread the word of like, how do we as therapists best help these kids?
It sounds like you think that therapy can be useful.
Yes.
And so can you talk about that? How can it be useful?
What we do know about therapy and children of divorce is that therapy gives them a safe space to be able to talk openly about how hard this is for them, right? Their whole world gets turned upside down. They didn't ask for this. And even if the divorce is a good thing because it creates less conflict in the home specifically, they're still going to be sad. They're still going to get frustrated with both parents. It's really helpful for them to have a space to process their own emotions and a space where they feel like they can say what they need to say about both of their parents without a parent having a feeling about it. Even like some schools offer divorce therapy groups, right? Like kids of divorce can meet together in a group and they can all talk about how sad it is, how much it sucks having to go from one home to the other home and carry all your stuff in a bag all the time. And they can find other kids who also think this sucks and is hard for them. In those aspects, like both those approaches to therapy can be really, really useful for kids. They can learn communication skills, right? Like how do they talk to their parents about when things are hard? They can get support they need. They can get empowerment even, right? And get some things normalized for them. And that's where I, like, both personally, I've seen therapy be helpful, where the research indicates it can help kids manage anxiety, take some of that stuff they're internalizing and pull it back out and like recognize that it's normal, it's not about them, right? The fact that your parents are divorced and that this is really hard isn't your fault. Because parents can say it all they want. Kids don't always believe you. A good therapist for kids can really help them process that stuff.
So how do you choose a good therapist to help you, like if you're in a high conflict divorce situation?
First and foremost, I tell people all the time, not every therapist is a good fit for everybody. So starting off with this recognition is we're going to try some people on. You don't keep a pair of shoes that doesn't fit. You don't have to keep a therapist that way either. Like if they don't fit, that's okay. Most therapists will tell you, if this doesn't feel like a good fit, we want to find you someone who is. We ask for consults. Can we talk for 15 minutes about what's happening in my family and if you're a good fit for us? Specifically, look at their experience. Ask what experience they have with divorce. What experience do they have specifically with high conflict divorce? If you're searching for someone who deals with the particular dynamic we're talking about, they might label it as high conflict divorce. Most cases that are labeled high conflict have a history of domestic violence. So whether that be verbal abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, or physical abuse. And we also can't disregard sexual abuse in relationships, right? So I'm using domestic violence as a very broad term to include all of those. People who have experience with domestic violence, high conflict divorce, those people will probably be better fits for what you're experiencing because they'll hopefully have a better understanding of what's happening in your family, right? They'll know to sort of look for larger patterns of power and control that's not helpful. They may understand why a parent feels very protective. Like they won't pathologize the parent who is being protective of their kids. It won't automatically be labeled a bad thing. They have experience with domestic violence. They have experience with divorce, co-parenting. Some of these people with that experience will name those things, parental alienation being another one of them. Proceed with caution around the terms, but it might get you to people who can help more, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah. And before we dive into your research, just one last question that might be helpful for our listeners, and that is just what are some protective factors that parents should know about?
I'm so glad you asked this question because if nothing else, what I have gleaned from the binders and binders of research that I have read is one of the most protective factors for children is for us as parents to stabilize. Even if only one of us does it, it is incredibly helpful for our children. What I mean by stabilize is we get the support that we need around how do we regulate our emotions? How do we process our feelings? How do we set good boundaries? How do we become less reactionary? And this is not to say that it is your fault. These things all make sense in the context of what you're experiencing. They're so valid and so real. And lots of people going through this will experience PTSD symptoms, will have high anxiety, will really struggle. But if we're really looking to help our kids, one of the best things we can do is go get help for that space. I have 2 adult children now who will say to me, when things got better for us is when you got better, Mom. So when my PTSD was better managed, when I had more ability to set good boundaries around their dad and not jump into some of the fray of things that he tried to pull me into, when I was able to stay centered because I had processed some of my stuff. I had gotten a lot of coping skills, got a better understanding of what good boundaries look like and how to set them. When I was more stable, they could figure out how to stabilize. I could help support them in that. It's also something that I'm hearing from other kids like mine, both in my research and in my clinical work, is that if somebody, I don't care who, but if some grown-up could stay centered and not jump in as often, and even if they did jump in, could come out of that and know how to recenter and how to restabilize and how to make it more peaceful. And peaceful is a vague term, I get, but they knew that this was a moment and that we would go back to some semblance of stability. There is work that you can do. While you may not be able to fix the courts and you may not be able to fix the way the courts are being used in your divorce and how that's looking, you taking care of you and you getting the support and help you need is the fastest way to create a safe and stable environment for your kids, even if it's only in your house and in your space.
Thank you for that. And let's dive into your research. Tell me about what you're doing.
What I wanted to know is that if me as a therapist wants to help kids who show up in my office like my kids, then I wanted to interview those kids as adults because I wanted them to be able to reflect on the experience and be able to tell me, looking back, what would have been helpful to them? What do they think now, knowing what they know and looking back at themselves, their younger selves? What do they believe would have been helpful? What could they have used in that space? But I also recognize that if this is the dynamic you grew up in, we want to be really careful about who I'm interviewing. So if you're a person who is over the age of 26, because I don't want you to have any financial or legal ties to a potentially abusive parent. I don't want there to be any power dynamic involved in that. I want to keep people safe. So if you're over 26 years old, your parents' divorce was high conflict or their custody dispute. And by high conflict, I mean was ongoing, lasted a long time. We spent lots of money and time in courts and dealing with lawyers and mediators and all the things. There was the history of abuse between your parents, and you were required to maintain visitation or parenting time with the identified abusive parent. If that was your experience, then you're the person I want to talk to, because I think you have so much to offer kids who are still struggling in this space. You have so much insight to provide to therapists so we can do a better job of this. And I've been able to collect some interviews so far. I'm continuing to recruit participants. I believe it's a voice that hasn't been heard. I believe, unfortunately, that it's a system that isn't going to change anytime soon. And so my hope is to both provide a platform for these individuals to tell their story, because I do want to know what that experience was like for you. I want to know how we as therapists screwed that up for you. Like, what didn't we do well and what could we do better? And then what are the skills you needed? What are the ways in which we could have supported you better as a field? And my hope is that I can take that information and I can disseminate that to therapists and lawyers and judges and people working in the family courts so that we can do better by these kids. And who better to learn that from than the people who lived it? I don't want to assume as a therapist I know the right thing, because I lived a different experience, right? I'm the mom who lived in that space. I was not the kid who lived in that space. I want to hear from the kids who lived in that space. So again, demographics sort of being anybody who can answer yes to those questions and is between the ages of 26 and 38. So we make sure we're dealing with the court system as close to what it is now as we can. Because before 1996, they didn't even really consider domestic violence as a criteria for determining custody. If that was your experience, right? Like, there was abuse in your parents' marriage, the divorce was definitely ugly and high conflict, and custody was challenging and ongoing. I would love to talk to you, because I just think there's so much to learn from people who lived that, because it's a brutal experience. I mean, from my end, I know how brutal it was. I can't imagine being the kids who have to go through this.
So you mentioned 1996 as a significant year. Remind me again why the year is significant.
There is an organization. They came out with a report in a study that recommended that this is a piece of what needs to be considered when we're looking at divorce and custody, right? Like, you need to consider whether or not there is domestic violence, a history of domestic violence, when you're making those decisions. It was sort of laid out as the report and recommendation based on what we've learned. And that is that this should be considered. That was, I believe, 1996 or within the couple of years of that. And that was when it should have been.
So domestic violence should have been considered when the court was deciding parenting time.
Because there was an understanding at that point that the power and control, like that could be used, right? Children could be used, courts could be used. We could be continually putting women or abused people, victims, I don't want to use that term either, but we could potentially be putting them in danger if we don't consider this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's not been broadly adopted.
That's tough, because then you have to prove that domestic violence occurred. And many times if there wasn't a police report with maybe some physical abuse, and it was some of these other more forms of abuse like emotional abuse.
Well, the term that really gets used now that I appreciate, because it's sort of more, it's encompassing of all of those, it's the coercive control, right? Like, if there's, and we're starting to hear that term more and more being used, thankfully, because it does give a better description of what it is we're talking about. It's that power and control, that coercion that happens in relationships.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up because I was wondering what that meant, the coercive control. So that encompasses all of the forms of abuse. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if you look at coercive control and you understand that this is why physical violence does not necessarily need to be present. I can use my example specifically. So my ex-husband, 6'5", 300 pounds. I'm a whole whopping like 5'2", 120. He only physically assaulted me probably 3 times in 15 years. He didn't need to do it very often because he's an intimidating factor, right? Sometimes the threat of violence is all it takes to control someone. And this idea that if we only identify abuse as physical assault or even verbal assault on someone, we miss that coercion and that intimidation factor and the other ways control can happen. You may never have to put a hand on someone to maintain power and control over their lives. But we put so much emphasis on that physical abuse piece, to your point. If there isn't a police report documenting cases of physical assault, and sometimes even when there are, the courts will still not allow that to be brought in. It's all hearsay. There are judges out there who think that when someone brings up and mentions that there's a history of abuse, that you're using it to manipulate the courts. Mm-hmm. You're using it to alienate your child from their other parent. And so the coercive control piece, if we can use more of that language, it helps explain that dynamic. That's becoming more widely understood.
Yeah, or to the level of the courts where they understand it. And that's...
Some do. If you get that judge, thank your lucky stars.
Right.
Because there's not a lot of them, but thank goodness there seem to be a few out there.
You've been through so much, and I appreciate you sharing your story with us and also sharing what you're currently working on that can be so powerful and helpful moving forward for other kids. And that's the hard piece, I think, like you mentioned, they're children and they can't really help themselves. They're just stuck in the situation. So can you reiterate why should people stand up and voice their story to you through this research?
I think a lot of times when we go through things where we feel powerless, which I don't know about you, but in the family court system, I often felt powerless. And it's a thing my kids have expressed too, that powerlessness, their voice didn't matter. It didn't matter what they wanted. My son said this very early. He said, no one asked me what I wanted. No one asked me what was happening to me. He's like, if someone had asked me, I could have told them what was happening and why it was problematic. He's like, but no one asked me. And if you felt powerless in those moments, here is your chance to tell your story in a way that we might be able to give it some power. It's a way to make a difference and to contribute. If you felt powerless, those are the people that I'm finding are most likely to contribute, right? Those are the people who are most likely like, okay, this is hard, but I will tell my story because maybe it's one less kid who has to go through what I went through. Your story matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
The great thing about research is we do our very best to de-identify you specifically. So nothing in the research says, here's your whole story and it's out there for the world.
So they have confidentiality then.
We do our very best to protect confidentiality. I try to de-identify all the pieces we use, but it's not, nobody's whole story is being published here. We're taking sort of what are the themes of what we're discovering. And if there's somebody's piece of information that feels really indicative of a certain theme, we may use that. There's no names, no locations. My goal is to have a collective story rather than here are all the individual stories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it can be painful to go back and kind of experience and share the story, but I also have to say that amazing things can come from those painful experiences, and it can be very healing to share the story. Like, it's why I created the app Peaceful Co-Parent, and also this podcast has been super healing for me because you do feel very helpless sometimes and powerless in these situations, and something great can happen from it too.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well, right? Like, how do we turn it into a useful piece? Like, opening up some wounds can feel really hard. And if we're worried that this will feel hard and difficult and you're going to need some help processing that, I will, if you're in Illinois with me, I will give you some referrals for therapists. If you're not near me, am I happy to go digging into my network of people and find somebody close to you? We will make sure you have support. I don't pretend that this is easy, and I don't pretend that what I'm asking for isn't difficult. And I also want to still give people the opportunity to, if that feels empowering for you, by all means, reach out and let's have a chat about it.
All right. Well, all your details will be in the show notes. So thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me. I hope you'll come back on the podcast when your research is complete and you can share what some of those themes that bubble up are and
Absolutely.
that we can learn from it. So thank you again.
Thank you. I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Peaceful Co-Parenting Podcast. I hope the time was well spent and you got a lot out of the episode. If so, please rate and review the podcast. I would really appreciate it. If you're interested in sending me a feedback message, asking a question, suggesting a podcast topic or guest, or downloading Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger as a tool for better communication with your co-parent, go to peacefulparentapp.com or see the links in the show notes. Have a great week, and as always, stay peaceful.
This episode of Peaceful Co-Parent was brought to you by the Equal Shared Parenting Program. Do you find that you're ever in need of someone to talk to, like a counselor or a therapist? How about legal advice? If you've looked into it, you know these services can add up financially. That's why the Equal Shared Parenting Program exists, to help parents be their healthiest holistic selves. It's a membership program that offers discounted and free services like behavioral health, free tax prep and advice, and access to financial education and credit counseling, all for the low price of $29.99 a month. Learn more about the Equal Shared Parenting Program by going to equalsharedparentingbenefits.org/PCPM. The PCPM stands for Peaceful Co-Parenting Messenger. That's equalsharedparentingbenefits.org/PCPM.